Hi everybody! Thanks so much for stopping by the homestead. Well, the last 7 to 10 days here in southern Missouri has been so hot and humid. Most days we're in the low hundreds, maybe the upper 90s, and it has been so humid. The mornings are like 85% humidity, and then, it kind of burns off a little bit and settles to about 60% humidity. And when it's that hot out, the humidity, it just makes it that much more uncomfortable. There are some things within the gardens and the greenhouse that are kind of suffering because of the heat, but the heat-loving plants are just exploding. Some of those plants are the basil plants. Now I have at least 4 different varieties of basil growing on the homestead. We grow basil mainly for pesto. This is Genovese basil. It's just growing like crazy. And this is the variety that I use to make pesto. We love pesto here on the homestead. But I have another variety that we use for tea. It's cinnamon basil. And then there are some other kind of dwarf varieties that I use just as companion plants next to some of our other plants to help maybe ward off some of the insects. But while it is getting so hot and they are just growing like crazy, there are lots of reasons that right now is the best time to be cutting them back, to be pruning them, and to be harvesting them. So I'm going to bring you along today. I'm going to be doing some harvesting here of this Genovese basil so that I can take it in the house and make pesto with it later. But there are other reasons to be cutting back your basil plants, and so I'm going to take you around to some of the other examples that I have here on the homestead of basil plants that need to be pruned or they need to be cut back, and I'll talk with you about why. So like I said, these gorgeous plants here are Genovese basil, and I use these to make pesto. We do not have enough pesto in the freezer yet for the year, so I will be making pesto later. I have done a couple pesto making videos before, and you can check those out. But today, I'm just going to be bringing you along to cutting these back, to preparing for the pesto making process. But I'm also going to be taking you into the garden area and showing you how to prune basil in general and why you would want to do that even if you're not growing basil for pesto. Well, the first thing that we're going to do today with the basil is to harvest the basil so that I can take it in the house and make pesto. Now, the best time for you to harvest basil for pesto is before it has started to go to flower. Now you can see in some of these areas that they're starting to form tiny little flowers, and then they get bigger, and then all of a sudden they're so tall and filled with white flowers. You really want to harvest your basil before it goes to flower because it will have the best flavor and will be very tender. Now, if you go out to your basil and you see that it's starting to flower, hurry up and cut it and make your pesto. If you realize that it's starting to go to flower and you don't have time that week or that day or whatever, go ahead and pick off the small flowers. Just pick them off and throw them onto the ground, or compost them, throw them to the chickens or whatever. And that's actually going to buy you some time. It'll probably buy you a week or so where the plants won't start losing their wonderful tender flavor and the tenderness of their leaves. But the best time to do this is before they've started to put flowers on at all. Now I want to talk with you about how resilient basil plants are, and you should not be afraid to cut them way back. When I cut back basil for making pesto, or really for all the reasons that we're going to talk about today, I cut it back hard. You can easily cut it back 2/3 of the plant, maybe even 3/4 of the plant, because it's so resilient, it's just going to bounce right back. So on this basil plant right here, I am going to cut it back to almost about 10 or 12 inches from the ground or from the soil level. You'll see how much that is. So this is how much I just took off of that basil plant. I went to the main stem and I cut it right at the main stem, and this is going to be some of what I'm going to use to make pesto. I can just wash these, pick all the leaves off these branches, and then use this to make pesto. Now, another thing is when you are cutting back basil to make pesto, you'll want to put the stems in some water. So I have a soup pot from the kitchen filled with water, a few inches of water, and I'm going to put them in there just kind of like you would for a bouquet of cut flowers. That will keep them nice and hydrated and plump and not wilty. And I'll tell you, you'll also want to do that when you take it into the house, even if you're not going to make pesto for a day or so. Rather than putting it into the refrigerator, you'll want to just keep it in water like a bouquet of flowers. Basil absolutely hates cold weather, also hates the refrigerator. And if you put it in the refrigerator while you wait to make pesto, there's a chance that the leaves are going to turn brown. And that is not very appetizing, and it doesn't make very great pesto. So I'm going to go ahead and harvest some more of this plant here. And I brought you in closer so that you can see how much of this plant I'm cutting back. Now I'm going to be isolating this branch right here, or this piece of this plant, and I'm going to be going to the part of the main stem, and I'm going to cut it about a ½ inch from an area that has more leaves. So what's going to happen, where I made these cuts right here, I made a cut here and a cut here. Right down here you can see a swelling on the stem, and you can see that's where other leaves come out. That is a node, and more leaves and new branches are going to start growing out of that node, and that's why when you cut it back, you want to cut right above one of those nodes right there. That is going to invigorate your basil plant to grow big again. Basil is very much a cut and come again kind of plant, where you can do this kind of pruning or cutting back or harvesting several times during the growing season, and then within a matter of weeks it's tall enough to harvest again. Now pretty much everything that's left on these basil plants here has gone to flower, and that means that really the leaves that are on here are not going to be very good for making pesto. They're going to be kind of bitter and a little bit kind of like stringy. So that's another reason to go ahead and prune back your basil, because you really can't use this. You can harvest it for your animals or for your compost pile, but you want to reinvigorate it so that in a couple months or a couple weeks when you're wanting more basil, you have nice, tender, beautifully flavored basil leaves. So all of these pots here, I'm going to just totally trim back right above a leaf node. I'm going to prune very, very heavily. And I just want to encourage you guys to cut back your basil and not worry about being too aggressive with it. Now that both of these buckets of basil plants have been cut back, this is actually 4 plants in here. It's important for them to get a nice drink. They need to be well hydrated, but it's also a good time to kind of give them some boost with a little bit of fertilizer. Whether that's a well-balanced, water-soluble, kind of standard fertilizer like a triple 20, or you could give them some compost tea, some liquid seaweed, some fish emulsion, something to just kind of reinvigorate them, help them get a boost and get growing again. Okay, I have all of the basil that I need for this round of pesto in the house, but there are basil plants out in the garden. I want to do a little bit of harvesting of the cinnamon basil that we have, but I also want to give you some examples of other times that you need to cut back and prune your basil plants. Well, we're out here in the big garden area where all of our plants are now planted in raised bed gardens. It's the first year and we have been loving it. Well, out here I have several more types of basil plants. While we're out here, I am going to do some harvesting of cinnamon basil, but I also want to show you some other examples of when it's a good time to prune back or cut back other basil plants. And maybe there is a time when you should just hold off and wait a couple more weeks. Well, I have 4 different planted areas of cinnamon basil. This one right here is actually nearly perfect timing to harvest. Now I'm going to be harvesting this cinnamon basil to make sun tea for Kevin. He really likes the flavor of cinnamon basil in a sun tea. It's not my favorite, but I do love to make it for him. You can see on this cinnamon basil that the flowers are actually purple. They are very beautiful, and many of these are just barely starting to flower. So like I said before, this is a really great time to harvest before they get really long flowers. And I'm just going to be using the same technique as before when I'm harvesting. Now this cinnamon basil plant here, I actually cut back dramatically probably about 3 weeks ago, and you can see how much it's grown back and looks absolutely beautiful. This cinnamon basil plant is definitely like just in the middle of flowering. It's actually really gorgeous. The honeybees love it. So in this situation, I really don't mind leaving all of these flowers for the honeybees. I don't need all of this cinnamon basil, but it is just a wonderful attractor of all of the pollinators here into the garden. But I did want to show you that I have cut this back once this summer already. It's grown back, it's humongous, but it's not quite as big as one that I've never cut back yet this summer. Let me show you that one. Now this one here I've never cut back. You can see that the flowers are so long. They're actually starting to die back and get brown. All of the branches are getting kind of old and spindly. This is a prime time to cut this back as far as rejuvenating it for another big round of growth and another big round of flowers for the pollinators. So this is one that I am going to cut back today. The one that we just saw that still has the beautiful flowers, you know, I don't need to harvest, but those bees really love it. So I'm going to leave that one in the garden to flower until it gets to this point and cut it back. So this is another situation where this is the prime time to cut back or prune your basil. In just a few weeks, this plant will look exactly like the first one that I showed you out here in the garden. This here is a dwarf variety of basil, and I am allowing that to go to flower for the pollinators. This is another variety that is going to flower, and I'm just going to leave it because look at how much the bees just absolutely love the flowers. Well, it looks like I have enough harvested to make a nice big round of pesto, and I've also harvested enough for some cinnamon basil sun tea for Kevin. You guys, I hope that you enjoyed spending some time with me learning a little bit about basil, hopefully giving you some confidence about cutting it back and then rejuvenating it so it can grow several more times this summer. If you're enjoying videos like this, make sure that you hit the subscribe button. And remember, the best way you can help us here on the homestead is just to share our videos on your social media. Until next time, thank you so much for stopping by our homestead. Take care and God bless.